Thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited to be talking to you about what makes a great training team. And we're going to cover some information about structure, processes, and development. This is a topic that is really relevant and near and dear to my heart. As Training Industries Director of Training and Development, I oversee our courses team, which means that I manage our development, our delivery, our marketing, and our sales for our Certified Professional and Training Management program, as well as our certificates and workshops for learning and development professionals. As Liz mentioned, I'm also an IO psychologist, and that means that I love research, and I also tend to kind of geek out when I'm talking about things that are going to improve the way that organizations perform and function. So you will probably see some of that coming through today in this presentation. Before we get into it, I want to do a quick agenda for you to set the scene. Today, we're going to take a deep dive into 4 main areas. So first up, we're going to talk about training team structure. We'll move into a discussion of the kinds of processes that you might be using within your training team. Next, we'll talk about leadership and how the leader of the training team kind of impacts performance. And we'll finish up with a discussion about how to develop your training team. These are the pillars that will help to support a high-performing training team. I included this quote here from Matthew Davis from the Training Folks. He wrote this article for us on our website about partnering with vendor companies. And I think the key point of this quote here is the emphasis on the clarity of job roles and feeling connected through a common goal. So let's talk about how the way that your team is structured can help you increase clarity and also be working towards that common goal. So structure. And here's another quote. This is from Dean Meyer, who wrote an article for our website as well about structuring your training team as if it were a business. And it is kind of like a business, right? We have a product, we have customers of our business. And so this article is really interesting because it draws some similarities between the way that we structure our training team and the way that businesses are structured. After the webinar, I promised to follow up with an email to share some additional resources, and I'll include a link to this article because I think it's a really good one. But really key here is to be thinking about how to structure in a way that makes business sense. So team structure does matter, and let's talk about why. Team structure impacts a number of team performance factors, right? So communication. If you have a really great structure, it can absolutely enhance team communication. Structure can also really inhibit communication amongst your team members. So important to think about that. Role clarity. If we have a really formalized structure, roles can be really clear and the responsibilities that fall to each individual member can be very clear. If we don't, role clarity could suffer. Process efficiency and decision-making are also impacted by the way that we structure our teams, as well as our team's ability to adapt. So if we have a really formal structure, our team may not be able to adapt in the face of change or different information. Structure also impacts interpersonal dynamics. So the way that we structure our team can impact how engaged our team members feel with other team members. It can also impact conflict. So team members may experience conflict, particularly if there isn't a lot of role clarity. It can also impact our ability in a training team to form external relationships. So to what extent are we interacting with folks who are outside of the training team, and that can impact our interpersonal dynamics. The structure can impact the career paths that are available to our L&D team members and what we see as possible in our careers, as well as the development opportunities that are available and the ones that are most important for continuing team performance. So understanding these dynamics is essential for making sure that your team is cohesive and effective. So let's talk about some structural characteristics. So here's some ways that we can think about the structure of our team. First of all, some of these characteristics are not necessarily within our power, right? So team size, largely beyond our control. Certainly we can request additional headcount, or we could choose not to fill some open seats. But for the most part, team size is a harder one to impact. But it is a structural characteristic. If you're a team of one, you probably aren't going to have a lot of differentiation in roles. You might be able to work with vendor partners to help supplement your team of one. But if you have a large team, there's probably a lot more freedom to create that structure. So it matters. Organizational position is another structural characteristic that you have to take into account. Where does your training department or training team sit within the organization? And I'm going to spend the next couple of slides talking through some different configurations and how they impact team effectiveness. But for now, let's just know that position matters and largely beyond our control. So here's some things that are within our control. Team composition and role diversity. So when we think about our team, how different are the various roles within our team? To what extent is there different responsibilities across each individual? If you have a lot of diversity, it means that your team is going to be able to manage the L&D process from start to finish, right? You'll be able to cover the full spectrum of L&D activities like content creation, delivery, evaluation. But that could lead to some conflicting goals and can have an impact on your ability to manage your different work streams, right? So if you've got team members who have very different roles, that managerial position, that team leader position can be a lot more complex because there are various work streams happening simultaneously that are very different in the kinds of processes that are being enacted. On the other hand, you might have a team that's made up of very similar roles. Maybe you run a team of instructional designers or content developers. In that instance, the managerial perspective might be a little less complex because everybody will hopefully be following a very similar process. And it may be easier for you to kind of understand and oversee that. But it does create some issues when it comes to being able to cross-train and see career development paths. So interesting kind of characteristics there. Similarly, role specialization is a structural characteristic that might be more within your control. So how specialized are the roles within your team? And this really refers to their expertise in specific areas. So if you create a ton of specialization, you're going to have folks who are really deep experts in specific areas. One of the drawbacks is going to be that that might create some silos. So team members might be so hyper-focused in their one area of specialization that they lose sight of that bigger picture. For that reason, it's really important that we strike a balance between specialization and getting that holistic view. And I'll give you a quick example of that. We talked about the team that's made of content developers. You might have one content developer who specializes in e-learning. You might have another who specializes in instructor-led training. A different way to divvy things up would be to have a content developer who specializes in onboarding, one who specializes in sales enablement. These create that really deep expertise areas. And when you do that, it's really important that you create share outs so that the folks who are really deeply specialized in those areas are sharing what they know with others, which will help your team to be more adaptable and flexible in the future. We'll talk more about strategies for that. Another characteristic within your realm or your control would be hierarchy or reporting relationships. As a team leader, you might choose that your team should be relatively flat and everybody's going to report into you. It might be more important for you, though, to create subgroups and have additional kind of leaders of those subgroups within your team. And there are pros and cons to both, right? So if you have a flat organization or a flat team, that could enhance decision-making and create a more cohesive team that's collaborative for all peers. We might be leaning on each other more. It could also lead to bottlenecks, though. So if you are one of those teams that has a huge diversity of roles, it could be that those diverse work streams are creating a lot of complexity for the manager. And in that case, a sub-team structure might be a better approach to help divvy up some of that managerial responsibility. Okay, the last characteristic I want to focus on before we delve into our organizational models is resources available. So if you are from a large team or you have a budget for external resources and you can lean on vendors, this can really help to supplement your team. And it's important that we think about those resources when we think about our team structure, right? Because we're going to need somebody assigned to manage those vendors. We also want to think about the skills that they bring to the table because that helps to supplement what we have in our team. You might also have cross-functional resources that you can use. Maybe there's someone in HR that can really help you with rolling out your onboarding development plan. Or I'll give an example here at Training Industry. Our courses team relies really heavily on our editorial and design teams to help us create that quality course material. And that is outside of our team, but a huge resource available to us. So that's one of the characteristics that we have to take into account when we're putting together our structure. So I promised to talk about organizational models. There are three main types of models for where your training team might sit within your business. And centralized, decentralized, federated, we'll talk about the pros and cons of each. So in the centralized model, there's one L&D department. All of the L&D operations are going to sit within that single business unit, and they're going to report into a senior executive or leadership team. With this model, team performance is going to benefit from enhanced alignment to company goals. Because you're so close to that executive team, you're probably going to have a greater sense of what those overarching business objectives are. Another team performance benefit is consistency. So likely the training that's produced is going to be pretty consistent across departments. There are team dynamic benefits as well. So team members in a centralized department, provided it's not a team of one, that it is a department of more than one person, are going to have peers that they can interact with and learn from. And there can be a sharing out of best practices, which leads into that consistency. It's also more likely that there's some defined career paths when we have a centralized training department, meaning you're likely to find that executive L&D position either in a centralized, or we'll get to the federated model in a moment. There are drawbacks to this model that we need to be aware of. So if you find yourself in this centralized training department, here's some things you should think about. Centralized department can lead to lower efficiency in large organizations. So if you are in a big organization, you have multiple lines of business across different geographies, it can be really difficult to create line of sight to those individual business units. It'd be really difficult to understand what's happening in those areas. So if that's a problem that you're experiencing, it's important to create structure and roles to accommodate for that. Can also lead to this model can lead to a feeling of limited resources. With all of these departments kind of coming at you with potentially competing demands or needs, you might feel the need to prioritize, and that can often feel like a conflict. All right, so next type of training model is our decentralized model. And this model, we don't have a centralized training organization, and instead we have various training personnel dispersed throughout the organization in each of those individual business units. This model can be really great if we are a large organization, our business units, our departments are dispersed across geographies, because it creates very strong ties between training personnel and the department that they serve. But because these training groups are operating relatively independent from each other, there are also some drawbacks. So let's talk about that. In this type of model, you tend to see some duplication of effort. You might find that there are multiple LMSs throughout the organization. You might find that there are multiple people or personnel fulfilling the same kind of job duties that, if they were combined into one role, wouldn't take as many resources. So that can be some drawbacks. Also, team dynamics can suffer in this type of model. These training personnel that are dispersed throughout the departments might feel isolated. They might feel siloed away from each other and not have that opportunity to really share out and get to learn from their peers. Still, there are benefits to this. In addition to having a better sense of the business unit and its needs, training personnel who sit in these departments are going to have a better understanding of the way that the business unit operates, of the departmental context and culture. It's more likely that the training that they provide is going to drive impact and be aligned to needs. Also, in terms of interpersonal dynamics, when individuals sit in these decentralized departments, they're going to feel a little bit more connected to the department that they serve. They get to take a little bit more credit for the successes of the department, or they might feel like they're more part of it. They also get to develop really strong relationships with stakeholders. So if you sit in one of these departments, it's important to think about how you can create mechanisms to really communicate across each of those training personnel across the organization. Okay, The third most common kind of model is the federated model. It's kind of a hybrid of the decentralized and centralized. So in this model, we have some of our processes centralized within one kind of central department. Typically, these are going to be processes related to administration as well as technology, like LMSs. And then we have training personnel who sit within each of the different departments of the organization, and they focus on the department's needs. That's typically going to be content development and delivery types of processes and training personnel. So teams that operate with this model are going to benefit from enhanced performance due to a balance between consistency and standards of practice that are going to be set by that centralized model, as well as a good understanding of what the business needs by being part of that department. Now, that is at its best case scenario, right? So when federated model works, it takes all of the pros from the centralized and the decentralized. When it doesn't, it can create a lot of conflict. Team dynamics in this area benefit from greater opportunities for career development. So there's a ton of opportunities here to move into lateral positions for cross-training or to move up into more executive L&D positions. So that can be really helpful for an L&D professional who's looking for continued career development. Downsides of this model can stem from issues of communication. So are all of these different training personnel communicating, and how are they communicating with the centralized unit? There can be conflict that emerges. So if you sit, let's say, in the finance department and your finance stakeholders are asking for something that the centralized L&D department has said doesn't kind of fall within our standards of practice, what's the right answer? Who do I listen to in this scenario? So that can create conflict. If you find yourself in this model, that's something to consider. Okay, so now it's time for our first poll, and we're going to ask how your organization is structured. So if you could weigh in, are you centralized? Are you decentralized? Are you in a federated model? If you aren't currently in a corporate L&D department, that's okay. Maybe just tell us what your previous position kind of sat in.
Beautiful. I'll give everybody about 5 to 6 seconds. Ooh, these are good results. So here are the results.
Okay, all right. So we have 30% in a federated model, almost 50% in the centralized, and then 21% in decentralized. So very interesting. We see all of you. We know that all of you need help with how to structure your teams. And we actually have been doing some research at training industry. We've long been conducting research on L&D careers. And this is kind of the results that we've found over time. So it's about 70% of L&D professionals that sit within a centralized role, either kind of in HR or in an L&D department, whereas about 30% are sitting outside of those areas. So a little bit more from our research than what we found in this poll, but still kind of coincides. So beyond the model of your training organization, which again may not be within your power to change, the way that you structure your training team may be a little bit more in your power. So let's talk about an approach to how to structure your L&D team. I've offered 4 tips here on the slide to help you when you consider what the best structure for your team is. So the first is that you want to understand business goals and create alignment. Your team should be structured to align with your business objectives. So it's best to define what those are. What does success look like for your L&D team? And what are the KPIs that are going to be used to evaluate your success? Understanding those business goals and how your L&D efforts align to those should be your guiding light as you're thinking about structure. Your next step is to conduct a needs analysis. So we conduct these diagnostics before we develop training. We also should do it before we think about the structure of our L&D team. You want to identify your core functions. So understand the essential processes and functions that your team needs to engage in to achieve the goals that you identified in step number 1. And then you also want to engage with your stakeholders to understand what their needs are and talk to them about how they prefer to work with L&D. Understanding their preferences and what they're going to bring to the table is going to help you when you're thinking about structure. As you're doing this, it's important to understand the skills and competencies that you're going to need on your team to meet those business needs. So get an understanding of your current capabilities. What are the current job roles? Where are there gaps in competencies and skills on your team that you need to be able to fulfill those core functions? Moving to step 3 is where you're going to define the core roles and responsibilities. So determine whether each function kind of fits within one specific job or whether it should be spread across multiple jobs, whether some of those core functions can be combined together into one job. A suggestion for how to do this, and I'm sure there are plenty of ways to go through this, but I would write those core functions down on a note card and play with different configurations of how they might fit together. It's almost like a puzzle that you're trying to fit together in kind of the perfect fit. I will say that there is probably not going to be a right answer, but there will be some wrong answers. So that's why it's important to really think through a number of options of how you might configure your training team to come up with the one that's going to be kind of most likely to produce those business results that you identified in step number 1. After you've come to that kind of structural conclusion, it's really important that you document it. So write down your specific job descriptions, make sure that you're clearly defining where your responsibilities sit, which role is responsible for which of those core functions, and how it interrelates with other roles. This is really critical to make sure that you have that as a guide as you're delegating work, as you're evaluating work, but also so that your team has that as a guide as they're trying to understand how they fit with the rest of the team. Also important to consider workload as you're thinking about team size. So can these core functions be completed or can they fall to one team member, or is that really a big workload and we're going to need to spread it across team members? Moving to step 4, you want to choose the right reporting structure. So is everybody going to report into one team leader? Do you want to group the team functionally so that there are various subgroups that work together and kind of report in? Will you want to choose a matrix structure? That's also a possibility for the way that you might structure your team. So consider different configurations and the benefits that you might experience from those. A pro tip is that you're going to build flexibility into your structure. So you don't want your team to think that this is set in stone. You want to create flexibility. So some tips for that: you want to include cross-training in your plan. Make sure that each of your team members have some cross-training on what the others do. Also, creating temporary project teams is a great way to ensure that team members get a chance to practice other kinds of functions so that there is that flexibility. And I do want to kind of just pause and say, you might be thinking to yourself, Amy, I have a team. I have a team. It came with job titles. I have job descriptions. Like, I'm not building a team from scratch. So how does this help me? And what I want to suggest is that you should be engaging in this process annually. You should be creating an audit of your team and the way it functions and thinking through whether you have the right structure, and if not, considering different changes. And there are several reasons why your structure might change. I mean, first, businesses are changing rapidly anyway, right? So the demands that are coming to your L&D team can change over time. But also, adding a new team member. Let's say you had a team member leave and you've hired someone new. They might have brought with them a whole new skill set that you didn't have on your team before. And at that point, it might be relevant and important to think about whether the team might be better structured in a different way, whether certain responsibilities should shift from one team member to another. So there's a lot of reasons why there might be a need for change. I would say that at least annually, you should be doing an audit to make sure that you've got the right structure in place to meet the continued needs of your business. Okay, so step number 2, we're identifying our core functions. I've got a tool that I think can help you with that. So training industry has this excellent model, the training process framework. This is derived from our certified professional and training management program. Some of you may have seen it before. It's a great model because it really lays out a number of the different functions of a training organization and how they might fit together. So I'll walk you through it. We call this our orchestra model. We've got 4 layers, right? So on the outside, we have our administrative layer. Moving inward, we have our content. Then moving in a little bit more, we have our delivery. And then one more step in, we have technology. In the middle, we have integration. Particularly, integration is important with technology, but all of these things need to be integrated. And we call this our orchestra model because we envision the training manager, the leader of the training team, sitting on the outside here behind administration and conducting, right? So they're overseeing all of these functions and making sure that they're working well together. Now, this model codifies functions that your training team may fulfill, but it doesn't describe exactly how your team should operate, right? So just because tuition reimbursement is listed here doesn't mean that your team is going to be engaged in tuition reimbursement. But this is a way to start thinking about what functions your team might fulfill and how you might organize them. Depending on your context, what your team does, this might change. And depending on how many people you have on your team, you might find that you have a team member assigned to each of the layers. You might find that you have a team member, several team members in the administrative layer and one in the technology layer. That can vary based on what you need. Actually, just recently saw a debate in our CPTM alumni community between whether or not a instructional developer, an instructional designer, could also be a facilitator. So can we merge content development with delivery in terms of putting a role together? And there are definitely pros and cons of doing that. So definitely don't take this as set in stone, but a way to start thinking about what your team might be doing. The training process framework is actually a great segue into our next topic, which is process. So here at Training Industry, we believe firmly that high-performing training organizations are process-oriented. And our research has consistently shown that that is a definition of a high-performing training team. So what does it mean to be process-oriented? Let's take a look. We've developed this scale that defines process excellence. So I'll walk you through this scale, and then I'll talk to you about the processes that encompass what a training team might be focused on. So at the bottom of our scale, we have this disorganized training process, right? So this is an ad hoc process. This process has not been documented. It's not replicable. Moving up, we have processes that are established. These are things that our training team has defined. We do have documentation on it. We may not be consistently applying our documented process, but we have established what our process is. Even better, we have our replicable layer. So this is where we have started to really apply consistently that process, and we are able to replicate the success and efficiencies that we see through that standardization. Moving up to the managed layer, this is when we're looking at our process, we're collecting data, we're trying to understand how the process is being enacted, and we're really exerting efforts for quality control. And then finally, at the top, these process-oriented organizations, high-performance processes are going to be subject to continuous improvement. So when we collect data, we may find that there is a need to improve that process. There also can be innovations that we need to incorporate into our process. So when we have optimized processes in our organization, we are continually improving them over time. So using that scale, we've been doing research for over 15 years on what defines a high-performing training organization. And it's so interesting. These process capabilities, these 8 process capabilities that you see on the screen are fairly universal. So regardless of whether your training organization sits in a healthcare industry or government, regardless of the size of your training organization, whether you're centralized, decentralized, we have found that most training organizations have at least some capabilities in each of these 8 processes. So starting at the top, and they are in order of importance. So strategic alignment, having really well-defined, optimized processes around strategic alignment is highly related to the performance of a training organization. Content development is the second most important. We have to be developing content that engages, that is appropriate for what we're trying to train. Number 3 here is diagnostics. So this is looking at your needs assessment processes, making sure that you've gathered the information before you go into content development to ensure that what you're doing is going to address business need. We have content delivery. Here at number 5, we have reporting and analysis. This is our evaluation of our training programs, also reporting out the impact to our stakeholders. Technology integration, with more and more technologies available, this process capability actually does grow in importance over time. Administration services, which are the backbone of our organization, and then portfolio management, which relates to the number of courses that we have available, or the number of training programs, what's in our learning library, how they all fit together, and making sure that we're constantly refreshing them, that we're updating them when they need to be, that we're retiring them when they're no longer needed. So that's managing our portfolio. I included this quote from Cheryl Haga. She's a CPTM, and she used these 8 process capabilities to think through the different components of the people that she would need on her team. So she looked at these 8 and said, do I have somebody who can be responsible for this process? Do I have more than one person who could be responsible for this process? And if I don't have enough people responsible for this process, given its importance, that's a gap. So that's kind of how she looked at these processes. And I think that's a great way to look at it. So it's time for our next poll. I'm going to ask, which process capability is your biggest strength for your training team? So forcing you to choose one and thinking through, are you optimizing your processes and your practices within that area?
Beautiful. I'll give everybody about 10 to 15 seconds. I know there's a lot of options, a lot of thought processes.
Yes, and there's no right or wrong answer. Kind of where are you strongest?
Beautiful. Okay, I'm going to close it up, and here are the results.
Okay, great. So if I'm not mistaken, content development is number 1. All right, great. That's great because that is one of the more important of them. We see that strategic alignment is next. So that is a strong area for a lot of training organizations. And very few are listing diagnostics as a strong area. Very few listing tech integration, reporting and analysis, portfolio management. So there's some areas that we can focus on. And I'm going to show you what we found in our research. Again, this is research that has spanned over 15 years. So spent a lot of time trying to understand where training teams are really strong and where they might need additional development. And this chart shows you the percentage of our respondents who were either managed or optimized in each of these areas. So those top 2 scale points exhibiting process excellence in those areas. So a little over a fourth of training organizations reporting that they're optimized in delivery processes, strategic alignment, content development. So kind of similarly with this group here in this webinar, that strategic and alignment and content development are pretty high in the areas. One thing that we thought would be interesting is to understand what percentage of organizations are exhibiting process excellence across all 8 of these process capabilities. And if we go back and look at it, to be optimized in each of those 8 is a pretty strong ask, right? So that's a lot of complexity that has to be managed within the training organization to stay optimized in each area. And what we found is that that's not a thing, right? So there are not organizations that are optimized in every single one of the 8 areas. So instead, we look to say, okay, we know what the top 5 most important are. How many organizations are at least managed? They're at least exhibiting process excellence at a managed level in each of those 5 areas. And what we found was that there's about a fourth of organizations that were performing really well across these multiple areas of process capabilities. So with that means that there are 3/4 that have some opportunity to develop. And where should we focus our attention? This quadrant right here shows us where our strengths are and where our opportunities are for improvement. So if we look in the top right corner, we see what our strengths are. We are doing pretty well at strategic alignment, content development, and delivery. Those are also really important process capabilities for defining high performance. So these are great areas for us. Going down to the bottom right, we see our opportunities for improvement. Diagnostics and reporting and analysis are considered a top 5, right? Diagnostics was number 3, reporting and analysis number 5. These are areas that we need to really think about improving. So these are our critical opportunities for improvement. We also have some additional opportunities in the form of technology integration and portfolio management, but where I want to direct your attention is the diagnostics and reporting, which is going to be the best place to focus your attention. So how do we develop process excellence there? There are a couple of best practices in each that I want to review for you very quickly. In diagnostics, it's really important that we've got some tools to identify competency gaps. So if you don't have competency modeling as a skill set on your team, that's an area where you could really create some big improvements. Being able to model competencies, being able to identify what the gaps are, and using those to feed into the content development process is huge for creating that process excellence. It's also really important that you're going to be able to recommend a variety of solutions, right? So L&D is not always the answer. And if you're not able to recommend other solutions or make the case why L&D is not going to help solve the problem, then you're doing a lot of work for nothing. So those are the 2 practices that you're going to want to develop processes around for diagnostics. And then for reporting and analysis, you want to be able to collect feedback from multiple different parties and also make sure that you're collecting multiple different kinds of learning outcomes. And in my follow-up email, which I promise I'm going to send, I will share out some information. Our Director of Research here at Training Industry, Dr. Tom Whalen, has done some really great work looking at the new ISO standards and how they apply to the measurement and analysis and evaluation of training. So I'll share that as a resource to help in that area. All right, I'm looking at the time and I think I need to speed it up. So I'm going to do that. Next up, we have leadership. The leader of the training organization is really critical to the performance of that training team. And I've got this quote here from Michelle Eggleston Schwartz. She's our editor-in-chief of our Training Industry magazine. The L&D team leader's plate is really full. And that can be really validating because it means that you are valued and people are looking to you within your organization for solutions. It can also be really overwhelming and hard to handle. So let's talk about the importance of the team leader. Training managers do matter. And in fact, our research has consistently shown that training managers are really impactful in the performance of a training organization. In fact, the #1 predictor of performance of the training organization is the extent to which a company is investing in the development of the training manager. And that's a really interesting factor, right? Because it's saying that that training manager and developing that training manager can have ripple effects throughout the entire organization. Below that, we've listed the other top 4 of the predictors, right? So we've got development, also using learning technologies. They are your friend. They can help supplement your team. Creating processes around them is really important. Training manager years of experience is important. So if you're not developing them, hopefully they've got a lot of experience that they bring to the table. They've developed throughout those years. And then partnering with vendors to supplement your team. So because organizational investment in training managers is so important, our next poll is going to ask about that. How much does your company allocate to the professional development of your L&D leaders? We know it's important. Are they doing this? Really interested to hear what you have to say, whether it's a $0 budget or maybe you can get some budget, but you don't have any kind of defined parameters. Interested to hear kind of what's happening with this group.
I'll give everybody 5 more seconds. I don't know what you're expecting, but I am very intrigued by the results.
I do actually have an expectation, yeah.
And with that, here they are.
All right, so 26%, so a fourth fall within that $1,000 to $5,000, and then the bulk say undefined. They need to ask for approval. So really interesting, great to see that there's a good group. 85% saying that there's some budget allocated, and I love to hear that. We have done this research at Training Industries, so I've been asking a ton of what my colleague calls teacher questions, where I maybe know the answer. Our research indicates that on average, the leaders of training functions, so managers, directors, CLOs have a little over $2,000 in their professional development budget. And there is kind of a wide range, right, between the smallest amount and the largest amount that we had reported. But what we also found was that about 18% have no defined allocated budget. So very similar to what we see here with our results. So what should we develop for our team leaders? Well, this is our training manager competency model, which we have derived from years and years of research to identify the 7 core responsibilities that a training leader really needs to have capabilities in. And then the key competencies within each of those areas that a training manager needs to be capable of performing. So, for example, strategic alignment in the center because it's so important. Competencies around influencing and negotiation, as well as strategic thinking, are really critical for the training leader in this area. In my follow-up, I'm going to share a lot more information about the competency model. So I'm not going to go into too much information here, but let's look at what we should focus on when we think about developing the leader in terms of these areas. So training leaders consistently identify strategic alignment as an area that they would like more development in. In fact, they are consistently rated very high in their strategic alignment abilities, and yet they always want more development. So I love to hear that because we know that strategic alignment is one of those key processes for the training department and one of those core responsibilities for that training manager to make sure that what we're doing in our training department aligns to business goals. Down below it, we've got optimized processes. Again, love to see that. This is a development need, right? So we're not one and done with processes. We need to be continually optimizing them. And it's really important that training leaders have development and training and continue to be able to focus on how they can better optimize their processes, because what they do really relates to the process excellence for the whole training team. So I'm going to move to the next slide and talk a little bit about strengths and opportunities for training leaders. Training leaders tend to be really strong when it comes to decision making and problem solving, planning and attention to detail. Where our opportunities lie are organizational performance analysis and performance measurement. So these are kind of these evaluative metrics, being able to understand training evaluation. Now, training leaders don't need to be able to do the analysis unless you're a training department of one, and then you're a leader and you're a learning analyst. But training leaders do need to know enough about measurement and evaluation to be able to provide guidance to those on your team who are doing this kind of work. That's very similar to the application of learning technologies. So training leaders need to know enough about learning technologies, the new ones, and the kind of more universal standard learning technologies to understand how they can be applied in the training team to improve process efficiency and ensure that our learning efforts are really meeting and exceeding our impact expectations. And then finally, business acumen. This is a key one. As a training leader, you have to be a student of your business. You need to be understanding what industry you're in, what your strengths and threats and what opportunities are within your business. It's really important that you are staying abreast of what's happening in your company's annual report, that you understand what the business goals are, what the 1-year, 5-year plan is for your organization. All of that relates to business acumen, in addition to things like what are the acronyms that our stakeholders are using and what are the processes that they're using. All of that feeds into the training leader's ability to manage their team and provide guidance on how best to meet different stakeholder needs. With that, I'm going to focus on development for the rest of the training team, because that is also incredibly important. I have this quote here from Thomas Harrell. It's something that we, I think, lament within L&D pretty often, and that is that we spend so much time focusing on what our learners need and how to develop them that we might overlook, and we do tend to overlook our own development. So that's also important. And as a training leader, it's really important that we're thinking about team development to keep our team growing and to continue to meet the needs of the business. So here I have 7 potential goals for team development. I'm going to cover them off relatively quickly because I know we are approaching the time that we need to use for Q&A, but we have skill development. So maybe when you're doing your audit of your training structure, you identify skills that are gaps within your team. And so you might want to work with individuals to develop those skills. It could also be that there's a gap across your entire team and your entire team needs some development in those skills. Example might be with the prevalence of AI and L&D, you might see a need to upskill your entire team on how AI can be used to supplement your processes. Another goal that you might have for your team is collaboration and communication. Making sure that your team is cohesive and really working well together is going to be really important for team effectiveness and functioning. You might also have performance improvement as a goal. Maybe there's some areas that you're not performing as well in, or some areas where it's coming and we need to be able to perform there. And so that could be a goal of your team development. Career development is an obvious goal. Our L&D professionals on our teams want career development. They did not get into this field because they don't care about learning. In fact, they got into this field because they love learning. So we want to make sure that they can see their path forward. It's also really important as a leader of your team that you're thinking about career development holistically. I think sometimes we get a little narrow focused on the individual development plan, that PDP that we're working with our team member on, and we're not looking at all of those PDPs together to make sure that they're really fitting together to build the strongest team we can. Next on this list is our adaptability and resilience. Maybe you work in an industry that's changing relatively quickly, or you're experiencing a lot of change. It's important that a team have this resilience and be able to adapt when things change. Next on the list, and maybe I should have put it at the forefront because it's probably, in my opinion, the most important thing to develop within your team, is that alignment on objectives and goals, right? So your team needs to know what they're working towards, and they need to agree on what those goals are and how to get there. That's going to be huge for enhancing your team performance. Finally, we've got innovation and future readiness. We know that as businesses change and as L&D efforts and technologies become more and more available, it's important that we're building creativity mechanisms, that we're helping our team to feel like they have that innovative ability. So these are just some of the goals that you might have. Maybe there's something else that you would want to add to the list. So let's do our last poll and talk about that. So I'd love for you to select your top 3. Don't select more than 3, but your top 3 goals for your team's development. And maybe you're unsure, and that's okay. Let us know if you aren't sure what your team really needs. Maybe you haven't done the work yet, and that's all right too. And maybe I didn't capture it all, and that's okay as well. I'd love to hear if there are things that I didn't capture. Go ahead and post those in the comments so we can have a look at what other teams' goals are.
I was about to say, I know this one might take a little bit, so I'll give everybody about 5 more seconds. And here are the results.
Okay, skills development up at number 1. I love seeing that. And I just want to check in. Okay, and then innovation and future readiness. Very cool. All right, well, I love to see that skills development is an important focus area, and we can talk a little bit about that as well as innovation and future readiness. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go through this entire slide. There's a lot of information here. You guys are going to get a copy of the slides, so you'll have this available. But here, I've mapped up some of the methods that you might use to achieve each of these various goals. And we'll go over skill development since that's number 1 in the list. If it wasn't your number 1, you've got a lot here to look through. So if skill development is really important for you, you might be engaging in role-specific training. So again, pulling individuals and giving them specific training to their role. You could also engage in cross-training. So skill development can also can be promoted through a cross-training type of mechanism where you ask your team members to train each other, and that can develop additional skills within various team members. That's also going to be helpful for resilience. External programming can be a really big asset here. So if you have some budget for your team development, external programming is going to be a good place to look. Developing training within your training team to train your team is a little bit too much for my head to wrap around. Instead, I'd suggest looking out there. There are tons of amazing learning libraries. There are tons of resources out there, courses for training professionals that you could use to supplement skill development within your training team. You might want to train your team on specific skills as well. So instead of looking kind of in an individual way, you might look across your team and say the whole team needs training in this specific area. And then another great option here is mentoring and coaching. So if you have the ability to assign a mentor or coach to a specific training team member to help them develop skills, that's going to be a good one as well. I'll also go really quickly through innovation and future readiness. I'll highlight a couple of things since that was a big one too. Scheduling regular team brainstorming sessions can really help with innovation. Creating cross-team projects can help with innovation and future readiness, exposing your team members to other ideas. And then also I'll say, trends. Staying abreast of trends is really important. And so scheduling sessions for your team to share out trends and discuss that could be really helpful for creating that future readiness. Okay, so I have 6 strategies here for you as a team leader for impact. 1, you want to embrace coaching over correcting. So don't just correct your team members, but ask them questions and help lead them to the correct conclusion. Sharpen your hiring toolkit. So really important that you're selecting the right people for your team to fill your team's skills gaps. If you don't have that toolkit right now, I am doing a session on hiring, recruiting, and maintaining your team for our strategy summit later this month. So that's a great session to attend. Build development into your team meetings. So just a couple of options for this. You could ask your team to share out something that they've learned in each of your team meetings, which formalizes that process. You could also start your team meetings with an icebreaker, which can help to create that cohesion and build rapport across team members. If your team is remote, it's really important that you bring them together. Nothing can replace that in-person interaction. And so if you have budget, I would suggest in an ideal world, bringing your remote team together at least once a quarter, but I would say bare minimum once a year. Bring them together so they can meet and work together. Don't be afraid to lose your team. So when you develop your team, they might gain some skills that now make them marketable, and now they might move to another team or another company, and that's okay. That actually means you've done your job in mentoring them and being a leader. And the flip side of that is, what if you don't develop them and they stay, right? So definitely don't be afraid to lose them. And finally, where you don't have the skills that you need on your team, or you don't have enough headcount, really consider supplementing with some external support. Vendors can be really helpful in this area. So I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you all for attending and bearing with me through my relatively long presentation. As I've mentioned, it's really important that you're thoughtful in the way that you structure your work, that you optimize your processes, and don't forget to develop your team.
Beautiful. I was going to say, yes, let's get into it because we have some really good questions. So we're going to take it all the way back to the very beginning. We have some questions when you show the different, types of charts and different models. So Beth was asking, is there an ideal headcount for each of the models or company size that would fit certain models?
Ooh, that's a great question, Beth. No. No, I would say a centralized is going to be for a relatively small organization is going to be best. So maybe if you're in a 500-person organization, we might find that to be a more likely model, maybe even 1,000. Whereas if you're, over 10,000, 20,000, you're probably going to be looking at a federated model. But I would say that there is no one prescription that is perfectly right in any scenario.
Perfect. And even with that, Amanda was asking, how do you create consistencies in a decentralized training department?
Oh, yeah, that's such a good question. Well, I'll share. I spoke with a CPTM recently who formed a community practice across her decentralized organization. So they meet regularly to share out what they're doing and to talk through kind of best practices and how they're implementing them. I think that that's an excellent way to bring people together and to really create more of that centralized, even if it's informal, centralized structure. Yeah.
Perfect. And as I say, we had another question. Could you just define again, what is diagnostics? They just
Oh, yeah, absolutely. These are your needs assessment processes. This is when you're really looking at what the business problem is. Your stakeholders shared they're having a problem with X, and you're using processes to identify what the best solution is and what the root cause of that problem is, right? Because a lot of times the surface problem is not what's really causing it.
Perfect. Ooh, the questions keep popping in. So now Francis is like, what about an organization of 2,500 people? Will a centralized model still work?
I think it can. Yeah. Yeah, I think it absolutely can. You know, in any of these models, it's going to be really key to create that process excellence, right? So they all have pros and cons, understanding the different disadvantages and advantages and creating process to alleviate or accommodate those issues is going to be really key to make those models work.
Beautiful. We did have a question in the chat, and they were asking, how would you align the L&D and a learning academy in the same organization? And we're wondering what your thoughts were.
Yeah, yeah, interesting. Well, I mean, I think that in a lot of cases, the Learning Academy is aligned into the L&D department, right? So because it can create this center of excellence and be almost like a university of training. So I guess I might need to revisit the chat to get a better understanding of the context behind the question. But I think it's an interesting one. I tell you what, I will promise to follow up with an answer to that in the email that I sent.
Yes, and Jose, if you quickly can type what your also additional thought processes were there, we could totally take a stab at it if we have time. But to keep it going, Denise was wondering, are there roles within the team that you would recommend combining if headcount cannot be increased?
Yep. So I would definitely say that when you have a small team, really important that you have a tight administrative function, right? Like that's going to be your backbone. So you want to probably combine LMS administration with some of the other administration functions because those kind of lean on the same skill set of organization and management. Beyond that, you might be able to combine like instructional designer with business unit consultant or partner. Those folks who are doing the needs assessment could also be developing the program if you have kind of that unicorn person who has a skill set across both.
Perfect. I was gonna say, I think we have one more question or time for one more question. And just, you know, for those 15% who have zero budget, I know we're probably all wondering this, what can I do to develop my team with no budget?
Yeah. So first, I just want to say I'm sorry that you don't have a budget. That can be really frustrating and it can feel like you're undervalued. We have a number of resources at Training Industry that I promise to share that you might be able to use to help secure a budget in the future. The good news is that there are so many free ways to develop your team, right? So, you know, we talked earlier in that slide, I shared out a lot of different methods. A bunch of those are free, but some good ideas that maybe aren't on there. You can create a book club, right? So Training Industry has a ton of articles, magazine, podcasts, webinars. So assigning those to your team to consume and then creating kind of a share out of lessons learned would be a great way to build some development for your team.
Wow, that's like a really great idea. Next time somebody asks, we'll say that. But with that being said, before I say our final goodbyes, Amy, is there anything you would like to leave with the audience today?
Yeah, I just want to say, you know, on the team development front, it's not an event, right? Same with learning and development. It's not an event. This is a continual process, and it's really important that you put together a plan to continue to develop your team over time.
Beautiful. Well, with that, thank you so much, Amy. All the comments in the chat are so kind, saying this was such a great session, and I cannot agree anymore. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming.
Yes, and with that, like Amy mentioned, we do have some up and coming webinars. If you are interested, you can register for these programs and watch past webinars now at trainingindustry.com. All of our webinars are pre-qualified for a credit hour by HRCI, SHRM, ISPI, and CPTM. If you're wondering what CPTM is, it is the Training Industry Certified Professional and Training Management program that Amy mentioned prior. It is the only credential focused specifically on the training manager job role. It is rooted in industry-leading research, and when you earn your CPTM credential, you'll develop the core training manager competencies. So you can join us for a virtual practicum from anywhere in the world, and you can find more information at trainingindustry.com/training. Additionally, Amy's session will be September 25th, 26th. It is our Training Industry Strategy Summit. You can register now for $99 to attend over 20 live sessions and have access to the on-demand content. Lastly, that evaluation survey should have popped open in another tab in your browser. We would appreciate hearing your feedback from today's session. Thank you again to our speaker today, Amy. And lastly, thank you all for your time and attention today. We hope to see you guys next time. Bye, everyone.